Good day, mi gente. This is Ray Collazo, and you're watching and listening to Bomba Live, the talk show you've been waiting for your entire life. Thank you so much for joining us. Please follow Bomba Live on all social media channels. Particularly subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you're getting full episodes, video episodes of Bomba Live, the talk show you've been waiting for, twice a week now, exclusively on YouTube and our audio platforms. So please subscribe to our YouTube channel. On it, we like to, as Bomba Live, kind of a very Puerto Rican flavored news, talk, and variety program. We like to give people on a regular basis updates on what's going on as it relates to noticias de Puerto Rico, Puerto Rican news, and things that are happening in our politics in the mainland primarily that are impacting the island of Puerto Rico and the residents of the island and then diaspora, and really, especially for Puerto Ricans that are now currently based on the mainland. You really couldn't have a better political commentator, political analyst, and someone that really provides us in both languages, really straight talk of what's happening as it relates to the island and how that impacts our politics and our communities, not only on the island but throughout the diaspora. And we are going to get into, because he's been clamoring to do this, a little salsa at the end of this show, so we can really kind of get into learn a little bit about this man's personality, the principal of FDA Solutions, and again, one of the best Puerto Rican political analysts out there, our great friend Federico DeJesus. Federico, muy buenos días, hermano.
Gracias, Ray. Thank you so much for your kind introduction. I'm really happy to be with you and your audience.
So I wanted to, with the time that we have here, I really want to kind of just go around the horn, if you will, and kind of touch on some of the issues impacting the Puerto Rican community. There's been some news over the last several weeks that, on some level, sort of ongoing issues that we're dealing with that really, and if you get nothing out of this episode, but one thing is that to really understand that there's the colonial status and the ongoing status of the island, however you think our future should be, there's uh, some very established and now evolving relatively newer policies that are really creating systematic challenges for the island and the growth of its economy and the quality of life for our family on the island. So we just wanted to kind of go around the horn to give you a flavor of what's going on with these issues, how they impact us. And ultimately, I hope we have a moment at the end of the show to really get into what you could do about it, whether you live on the island and whether you live on the mainland. And Federico is a great resource for that. So Federico, let's just start with an issue that's been really garnering a lot of attention from the activist class throughout the Puerto Rican community, Act 22. So share with people what Act 22 is briefly, and how this hashtag End Act 22 movement is really burgeoning and something we should be paying close attention to as Puerto Ricans.
Sure. So when Puerto Rico started its recession, I guess you could call it a depression because we've never really recovered, in 2006, it was mainly because Congress eliminated tax incentives that created manufacturing jobs. Puerto Rico, as many people know, was the hub of pharmaceuticals in the world, not just in the United States and the Americas, but in the world. And after that tax incentive expired, many factories and with it jobs left. And that caused another great migration of Puerto Ricans to the States. So a lot of people in the diaspora used to work in these factories and have to be in the United States now because of the loss. So the loss of population also damaged the real estate market. And you had all these luxury homes that were not being sold. So we had a Republican governor back then, Luis Fortuño, who enacted a law, Act 22, that said that if people hadn't lived in Puerto Rico for the previous 7 years, basically, if you weren't Puerto Rican, you could move to Puerto Rico, not pay any capital gains taxes, and all sorts of Puerto Rican taxes would be reduced to zero or at least 4%. This, Puerto Rico is the only place in the world where you can move to and not pay any federal income taxes to the United States. So this made it very effective. And a few people moved and bought a house and started to take advantage of these tax incentives. But 11 years have passed. And what has happened since? The real estate market in Puerto Rico has boomed. It's displaced Puerto Ricans in the island, within the island, and some to the United States because real estate market prices are going up. But it's only created 30,000 jobs. Now, in 11 years, 30,000 jobs for an island of 3.5 million is not a lot. And we mentioned manufacturing tax incentives that created jobs. Those created 300,000 jobs in Puerto Rico. So what this is doing is benefiting crypto people that are moving to the island, investors that are going to the beach and watching their investments grow and not paying any taxes on it, but actually not creating any jobs. Why? Because the law doesn't require them to create jobs. It has fluctuated between maybe 3 and 5 jobs. That's you, your wife, and your maid, basically. And you have these people like Brock Pierce and Logan Paul, who've swindled Puerto Ricans. They come in, you're required to invest in local charities. So they set up their own charities and they're cheating Puerto Ricans out of promised funding, out of contracts. And so this movement, you mentioned the activist class, it's really communities in Puerto Rico like Puerta de Tierra, like people in Rincon, in Aguadilla that have risen up and say, we have a right to live in our own land. And people that are accusing the pushback on class warriors, even xenophobia, because most of them are white Americans. Well, wait a minute, Puerto Ricans that move into the States don't get tax breaks to live in California for free. They don't get any tax breaks to move to Florida and not pay the IRS a cent. And these communities in the United States are deprived of their tax revenues. So it's not just something that affects Puerto Ricans and colonial gentrification in the island, but states like New York are losing tax revenue because these people, that's rich, mostly rich people, are moving to Puerto Rico and not paying any taxes there either. And so it's really the height of colonialism. Puerto Rico, unlike Hawaii, unlike the expansion of the West, was really never, colonized by individual Americans. It is a colony, but Americans didn't move to the island, right? And now, 125 years after the invasion, you have all of these enclaves of Americans moving and being freeloaders in the island, not paying any U.S. taxes and very little Puerto Rican taxes, and they're making life a lot harder for residents of the island. And so you have this conundrum where people are being displaced from Puerto Rico, from their communities in the island. They have to go to the United States, and guess what? If you move to Florida, New York, or other places that most Puerto Ricans go to, there's gentrification in major urban cities as well. So Puerto Ricans are stuck in this, between a hard and a rock place of what colonialism in the 21st century looks like.
No question about it. And Federico, it's so interesting you say that, because thinking about kind of post Maria and what would be some of the sound policies that could help build up the Puerto Rican economy, try to address the debt, which is a whole other conversation, which still exists and is still part of the dynamic of kind of choking the economic growth for working Puerto Ricans on the island. And instead of kind of looking at how do you create incentives so that Puerto Ricans could build their own small businesses, there's been kind of this organic movement post Maria of doing that on the island, buy their own homes on the island, develop their own land on the island. We're seeing this, to bring other people in who already have a wealthy, and displace Puerto Ricans that are already dealing with some of these issues that were exacerbated by post Hurricane Maria. It's so, it really is kind of codifying in many ways. Again, and we won't get too much time to get into the Jones Act today, but another example of how, federal policies are codifying the colonial status of the island. Federico, so now we have, fast forward, we now, besides this kind of organic campamento movement that's happened on the island, that most people see in memes with Puerto Ricans camping out to make sure that our beaches remain public and our land remains for the people. But now we see a movement, an Act 22 movement that Congressman Nydia Velázquez, amongst many other leaders, is supporting. So tell us a little bit about this movement to, that some are titling hashtag Act 22 and Not Your Tax Heaven, Puerto Rico.
So thank you for asking. I'm part of a project called Losing Puerto Rico. Please go to losingpuertorico.com to find out how you can act, right? So these tax incentives don't come out of the blue. Puerto Ricans in the island don't pay federal income taxes because we don't have any representation in Congress. And the idea was, let's get Puerto Rico set up with their own revenues and their own government, right? Not as a loophole for these rich Americans to take advantage of. So what our project, Losing Puerto Rico, the folks at the Center for Popular Democracy, Nydia Velázquez, Vamos, and other island-based groups are calling for is for Congress to act. Why? And you may wonder, well, isn't this a Puerto Rican law? Yeah, it is a Puerto Rican law, but the only reason that this law is so attractive to these so-called investors or crypto colonizers, like people call them in the island, is because, again, Puerto Rico is the only country in the world where you can go, not pay any federal income taxes, and not have to resign your U.S. passport. So what's the solution? A, the legislature of Puerto Rico could repeal the law, which they've been unwilling to do, or Congress can say, well, guess what? Only people born in the island or their descendants get these tax breaks, meaning not pay federal income taxes while you're in the island. Congress, unfortunately, rules Puerto Rico. We saw it with Promesa and the Junta, the control board that Congress imposed on Puerto Rico. Congress reigns supreme. So they can literally remove these tax exemptions from these colonizers going to Puerto Rico and say, guess what? If you move to the island, you're not going to be exempt from federal income taxes anymore. That was just meant for Puerto Ricans, and it should stay that way, and not for these fly-by-night investors. So what these groups are all getting together and saying is, if the Puerto Rican legislature doesn't get their act together, Congress needs to act. And why? Again, this isn't just an issue that affects Puerto Ricans in the island. It affects Puerto Ricans in the States and other non-Puerto Rican communities in the United States that are being deprived of their tax revenues. And if this were benefiting Puerto Rico, well, hey, there's trade-offs. I'm a left-of-center Democrat. I'm not against tax incentives. I think that they can create jobs, but they should be meant to create jobs. And the government of Puerto Rico is saying they're not going to require job creation for these people. So then is that economic development? Jobs aren't a part of the equation anymore? That's just leaving a lot of people very perplexed. Tax incentives should be for businesses to create jobs, not individuals to be sitting on a beach watching their bonds grow and their money grow while they're not paying a cent to Uncle Sam and very little to the Puerto Rican Commonwealth.
So follow Act 22 and the Losing Puerto Rico movement, and I'm gonna and we'll definitely repeat that information before the end of the show. The other news headline this month that took place, Federico, that I wanted you to give people some perspective on was the latest Supreme Court case that basically, codified and confirmed from a judicial perspective that La Junta, the Fiscal Control Board, does not have to respond to FOIA requests and have the same level of transparency that other government entities would have as it relates to the federal level. This was a court case that was brought on by our great friends and great champions for journalism, CPI, Centro de Periodismo Investigativo, and from Puerto Rico. So catch people up on that court decision and how that impacts Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans trying to understand what the Junta, which controls the fiscal affairs of the island, is doing.
Sure. So again, let's step back. Congress eliminated these tax incentives in 1996. They phased out. In 2006, they ended. Puerto Rico had its first year of recession. There was a government shutdown. And Puerto Rico, in 2015, declared they didn't have money to pay the debt. It partially defaulted, and then Congress stepped in 2016 and said, we're going to freeze all of these lawsuits from bondholders, and we're going to impose a fiscal control board that's going to represent the government of Puerto Rico in a court-supervised restructuring, not bankruptcy. And why that matters is because this unelected body gets to overrule laws that are duly signed by the government of Puerto Rico if they're incompatible with their view of austerity is. And not only that, but they're also sovereign according to the Supreme Court case that you mentioned. The United States Supreme Court, in the chutzpah of colonialism, has said not only that the Centro for Periodismo Investigativo doesn't have a right for the information that the Junta is putting out, meaning that FOIA doesn't apply to the Junta, the Puerto Rican Constitution's right to public information doesn't apply to the Junta, but it said that it has sovereign immunity. Again, a colony is not sovereign by definition, and an unelected body, by definition, is not sovereign, but it is saying that it has sovereign immunity to shield it from sharing public information that affects people's lives. This Junta has cut pensions for Puerto Rican public workers. It has imposed deep austerity. And again, it's an undemocratic board, can overrule and has overruled duly elected and enacted laws that have been approved by the legislature, the elected legislature, and have been signed by the governor of Puerto Rico. But the Supreme Court has not been willing to overturn the so-called insular cases that say that Puerto Ricans are savages, literally, that we are savages that are not fit for the blessings of democracy. And it says that Puerto Rico is owned by, but not a part of the United States. So when Puerto Ricans say, oh, we're part of the United States, no, you're colonial subjects. Yes, we're born U.S. citizens. But if you live in the island, it's rule supreme, except for certain fundamental rights. And what the Supreme Court is saying is that the fundamental right of information does not apply to the colony of Puerto Rico. That's just wrong. We don't know the negotiations they're doing with the bondholders or with the court. Yeah, there's some confidentiality that's normal, But just to have a blanket immunity saying that nobody can dare question the junta, and it's by design by the United States Congress, is just wrong, unfair, and undemocratic. And that's going on today. I know that a lot of people want to go into whether Puerto Rico should be a state, a sovereign nation, if we want to have more autonomy, free association. But we're dealing with a junta today that's making decisions today over how much people are going to pay for water, electricity, how many schools are going to be open, and what the government can do with its own money. And that's the situation that the U.S. Supreme Court has put Puerto Rico in, where it hasn't really reined in the supreme powers. They call it plenary powers of the United States Congress over the Puerto Rico.
I thought the quote that really struck me when I was reading the decision was referring to the Fiscal Control Board as an entity within the government of Puerto Rico, which is so ironic because it oversees the government of Puerto Rico and is not beholden to the governor of Puerto Rico, the government of Puerto Rico. And as we can see, not the people, certainly not the people of Puerto Rico. And the people are curious, by the way. It was an 8-1 decision. And our dear Justice Sotomayor actually voted with the majority. And that's a whole other conversation. But, she essentially agreed with the judicial theory that, Puerto Rico in this case doesn't have that level of rights, Puerto Rican people on the island, as other Americans in other locations. And we're talking to just an incredible political analyst and a great friend, Federico DeJesus. We're going to talk about some more fun topics here in a second. But finally, Federico, yes.
Wait, but let me point that out. So why is the junta an entity within the government of Puerto Rico, even though it was appointed by the President of the United States and by Congress? And the reason is simple. And this was discussed in a case called Aurelius versus, I can't remember. The case is called Aurelius. Basically, the unions and the hedge funders got together and said, well, wait a minute. If they're appointed by the Congress, then this is a federal entity. But the Supreme Court said, no, it's a Commonwealth entity. And the reason they decided that, even though it makes no sense, it's because if they would have said that it's a federal entity, again, guess what? That means that the United States would be responsible for paying Puerto Rico's $72 billion debt. And they don't want that, right? They want to pay the bondholders. And that's the reason why that happened.
That's a good point, because it's so interesting. And this came up, and I think we met during this time period, Federico, 10 years ago, with the discussions amongst the Puerto Rican intellectual class. Well, hold on for a second. If it's Puerto Rico's debt, it really is the United States debt, because we're part of the United States. And that was, and you just talked about, what you just laid out is basically how, they kind of cut that issue, that logical conclusion to the past by manipulating some of these guidelines. You're absolutely correct. Federico, real quickly, if there's I know there's Puerto Ricans watching this throughout the diaspora and on the island that are, obviously concerned about these issues. Give people, besides following, and I encourage people to follow losingpuertorico.com. There's some great digital content, and I want to bring on the documentarian that you're working with, Federico, that's producing some excellent content to lay these issues out to people. What can people do to get engaged in these issues leading up to the 2024 elections?
So yeah, thank you for mentioning the documentarian. I combined forces with a journalist, Nomiki Cons from New York, who has studied and documented Puerto Rico since Hurricane Maria, first as part of the Young Turks and now with this docuseries. And Adrian Perez, who's based on the island, was the editor of this series of videos. And again, there's a wide coalition of folks working on this. And when you go to losingpuertorico.com, you'll get the information and a petition so you can ask your member of Congress to close the loophole. Tax these rich investors that are exploiting Puerto Rico. Follow at Losing PR, follow Power for Puerto Rico, follow the Center for Popular Democracy, and all these groups that are taking over the island. You mentioned people invading the beaches. These are rich people that, again, are freeloaders, not paying taxes, and they're literally invading the beaches so that they can own them and not the people of Puerto Rico. By the way, under Puerto Rican law, all beaches are public. It's not like in New Jersey where they charge you to go to the beach or you can own a beach. These are public lands that are being taken over by rich people. So if you're not on the island or you don't have people that can go and literally physically do an encampment, call your member of Congress and say, this is unfair. Say, abolish La Junta. Say, please repeal the Jones Act that's making so much, it's a $1.5 billion a year tax on Puerto Rican consumers because we have to ship everything in U.S. ships that are the most expensive in the world. And there aren't enough U.S. ships to do a lot of the things that we need to do. And guess what? Puerto Rico buys most of its natural gas before the war with Ukraine from Russia. And we're not buying it from the United States. So again, this is not benefiting U.S. communities. This is benefiting a duopoly of shipping manufacturers and shipping industry that is exploiting Puerto Rico. And it's the same thing with Act 22. It's not benefiting the local population. It's not benefiting commerce in the United States or our population. It's benefiting these crypto Wall Street investors that are freeloading in the beaches and watching their investments grow and not paying a cent to Uncle Sam or to Puerto Rico. That has to end, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come on here so that our gente can know what's going on and how what's going on in the island inherently affects them here in the United States. Because, you know, you go to Philly, I was in Holyoke, Massachusetts, and you see people that had to move.
Es un pueblo de Puerto Rico, hermano, up there, Holyoke. Ay, Dios mío, brother, I love Holyoke.
They can't afford, so it's not a hurricane, it's a hurricane of crypto colonizers, and they can't afford to live in their own land. And we don't want to be Hawaii. We don't want to be the servers of these rich Americans coming and taking over our own land. And that's not xenophobic, because a lot of them aren't white. Some of them are of Pakistani descent. And Americans live in Puerto Rico, pay taxes, create jobs, and they're more than welcome. What we don't want is to be exploited in our own country.
Exactly, Federico, and I want people to understand this living in the diaspora. The irony and a silver lining in the fact that we have been displaced even more from starting with the fiscal crisis through Hurricane Maria, the earthquakes, and it goes on, is that the fact that we have prominent Puerto Rican leadership and Puerto Rican that live all over the country in all these congressional districts that have access to all these senators and people on the federal level. So if you're Puerto Rican that lives in Phoenix or Alabama or North Carolina, you have members of Congress, you have senators that you can educate about these issues and exert your local influence so that they understand that these issues impacting Puerto Rico impact their own constituents that live in the United States. In the case of Puerto Ricans, we can all vote. So we all need to get involved in our local community, educate your local federal officials. They probably have very little idea. Most of them have very little idea about the issues that impact Puerto Rico. So let's take that opportunity of being disparate around the diaspora to influence what's going on the island. You know, I wanted to change subjects with your brother before I let you go because, you know, one of the things I want people to understand is Federico's not just a political expert, but he's also un salsero tremendo, brother. So, you know, let's share with people what salsa means to you, to give people a little insight on another side of you and your personality, because I know that, and we're going to have these conversations with you, brother, on Bomba Live, because salsa means so much to us. So, habla un poco de la música de nosotros, brother, la salsa.
Muchas gracias. First, if you have relatives in the island, tell them to call the legislature and ask them to repeal Act 22. And there's actually a bill by Senator Juan Zaragoza that will require these people to pay higher taxes and invest 1 million jobs and create jobs. So those are good initiatives we should support. And look, salsa is very important to me for several reasons. My culture, my national identity is key to who I am and to my work. When I was growing up in Puerto Rico, salsa was seen by some people in the elites like esos cocolos, esos cafres.
Sí.
But
había en esa época los salseros contra los rockeros y sí. There was a class dynamic there, which is now happening with the la música urbana movement. It's the same thing. Very similar.
And then when I was a bit, you know, I was very young, and then when I was a teenager, then it became the underground, or now they call it reggaeton, versus the people who like reggae and other type of music. I like all sorts of music, including country music, by the way. But salsa means a lot. I took lessons when I was in high school to learn how to dance salsa. It was key to be able to have fun in parties so that you can dance and meet girls and just have fun. But when I went to the diaspora, I realized, well, wait a minute, wasn't salsa invented in New York? And I really learned a lot from my dancing from Venezuelans and other folks. And it became that I was dancing more salsa in the States than in Puerto Rico when I would come back. Now everybody's dancing salsa here and there, and it's super popular. But back then it was like a type of resistance. And it was a method really to have a lot of fun and get in tune with not just my Puerto Rican identity, but my Latin American identity, Ruben Blades, and all these great salsa singers that, again, were out of New York City, Puerto Rican and Cuban music. And I think that knowing what the diaspora means to our people is very important. If it wasn't for the diaspora, the Navy would have not left Vieques, that little island off of Puerto Rico that was bombed by the United States Navy. If it wasn't for the diaspora, salsa wouldn't have been born in New York, right? So I think that knowing our power and obviously having a lot of fun and being in tune with your identity is why salsa is so important to me.
Who's your favorite salsero, Federico?
Hector Lavoe by a landslide. But I do love Mark Anthony. I think that Fania, with the lyrics and the originality, but in terms of beats and keeping it fresh and modern, Mark Anthony's been a great ambassador. And I really like that Bad Bunny is mixing in some salsa, some merengue with the reggaeton. He's doing rancheras now. And even though he's a reggaeton artist, when he went to Coachella, he did the history of salsa and our people. And I think that we need to keep it alive because that's who we are. And you know what? When we are who we are, when we don't have those complexes of inferiority that some people try to impose on us, the world admires us and respects us more. And I think that Bad Bunny, Mark Anthony, and all these great artists are a very big example, not just with their music, but with their activism. We kicked out a governor, a third of the island, 1 million people took to the streets to kick out a governor. And some of these artists were fundamental in doing that. We're very proud
Residente,
of our
Bad Bunny,
people.
Ricky Martin, tremendous. And showed that intersectionality because a lot of what spurred it on was there was a lot of things, but those those homophobic remarks that were on that chat. And that kind of was like the straw that broke the camel's back in many ways. Federico DeJesus, the principal at FDJ Solutions. We're going to bring you back, bro. Next time you come back, well, I want to bring on those documentarians you're working with to talk about the losing Puerto Rico content. It's incredible content y'all are producing. And then I want to see if we can get one of these salseros, one of our friends like Frankie Negron or one of our friends in the salsa scene to really talk about how salsa music kind of is still alive and it's being kind of kept alive as well with the Música Urbana movement. A lot of the reggaeton artists make salsa music, Zion and Lennox, Bad Bunny, the list goes on. And also how salsa music has been a form of resistance and activism in our community, continues to be. Federico DeJesus, gracias. We're going to support all the work that you're doing to end Act 22 and all of your great initiatives, hermano. Have a great day.
Muchas gracias, un abrazo. Y saludos a Frankie, que es amigo y activista.
Oh, sí, claro que sí. Hablamos después. Hold on.